Hollywood adaptations of Stephen King weren't really Stephen King movies. Carrie was more of a Brian De Palma movie. He was a bigger name. Nobody knew who Stephen King was really at that time. Of course, The Shining was a Stanley Kubrick movie, way more than a Stephen King movie. But by the time you get to the early 80s, Stephen King's name was more of a selling point. I think Dead Zone, the novel, came out in 1979, and it was actually Stephen King's first New York Times hardcover bestseller. So after that, filmmakers were able to start using that author's name brand recognition to sell the films. I guess that started with Creepshow coming out in '82, where you actually had Stephen King's name on the poster. A couple of years after that, when Children of the Corn came out, that was the first film to give Stephen King a possessory above the title credit, which is not something that very many authors ever get, and especially when they're not really involved in the making of the film. So that kind of raises this question of what people are expecting from a Stephen King movie. All of the Dino De Laurentiis produced adaptations of Stephen King started to kind of set that mold.
More than any other author that I know or have worked with, Stephen King understands the difference between books and movies. He also knows the importance of a story, and it seems that the best King adaptations are the ones that hew most closely to the books. But films are external and books are internal. The best adaptations of King are the ones that are able to externalize what's going on inside the characters' heads, and The Dead Zone is one of those.
I've had another episode.
Oh, yes. Go on.
I've been tutoring this boy. His name is Stuart, and in the vision, I saw him drown. I saw him die, Sam, but that's not the point. In the vision, there was something missing. It was something I couldn't see.
How do you mean?
I don't know. It was like a blank spot, dead zone.
Lorimar Productions initially optioned the adaptation rights for The Dead Zone in early 1980, and it was going to be a project for director Sidney Pollack. That probably was a response to what was going on with horror movies at the time, because in 1980, 1981, into 1982, everybody was making slasher films, and slasher films became synonymous with horror films. You have The Dead Zone in development for that 2-year period where it really couldn't get off the ground. It was kind of out of step with the times, but there was a big moral backlash and critical backlash against slasher films, and something sort of happened in 82, 83 where there was an opening for a different type of horror film that was a little classier. And then The Dead Zone went into turnaround, I think, for about a year, which is when Dino De Laurentiis picked it up, and he didn't like the existing scripts, so he started looking for new writers, and the first person he went to was Stephen King.
Ironically, the very first Dino De Laurentiis production, based on a Stephen King book, managed to hammer home all of the hallmarks on what made Stephen King great. It was a deeply emotional movie that realized that the horror that can be universal amongst us is a horror that's shared in the heart and in the gut, and not just viscera splattered on a screen for teenagers.
Deborah Hill, I believe, suggested 2 people to Dino De Laurentiis. I think it was Walter Hill and David Cronenberg, and I think Walter Hill was busy on a project at that moment, and David Cronenberg was not. Cronenberg was determined to do a version that was more faithful to the source material, supposedly, than even what Stephen King himself wrote.
You leave my boy alone.
You knew, didn't you? You knew.
The Dead Zone was as good for Cronenberg as Cronenberg was for The Dead Zone, because it was a real change. The Brood was the first film where he really dove into the emotional psychology of the characters, where he really touched heart as well as gut. But in The Dead Zone, the Johnny Smith character is so deeply hurt, and his soul is damaged as well as his body, and it's a really painfully sensitive performance by Christopher Walken, maybe his best ever.
So instead of doing something that had the kind of boldness and subversiveness of his earlier films, I think Cronenberg really latched onto this as a character-driven piece with much more of a slow burn quality to it.
As the spells, the visions grow stronger and more powerful, so the body weakens. But I don't really need any research or documentation to see that this thing is sucking the life right out of you.
1983 was the breakthrough year for Stephen King movies. It had been 3 years since The Shining, and then all of a sudden you've got 3 adaptations in 1 year: Cujo, Christine, and The Dead Zone. You had critics, a lot of them making jokes about the Stephen King movie of the month, but they all did fairly well, and the Dead Zone was really right at the top of the heap. Even Stephen King liked it. Look, if Stephen King likes an adaptation of his work, I think he's maybe the hardest audience to please, and he liked the Dead Zone. He said the Dead Zone was like a perfect marriage, like 2 flavors that shouldn't mix but did.
So it was a real change in the course of events in horror cinema, in that it took its horror as seriously as any Oscar-winning drama would.
I love
you. Dino De Laurentiis actually, he kind of backed into Firestarter as a movie project. He didn't develop it from scratch. So it's sort of the same thing with Dead Zone, where he inherited something that was already in motion. The movie rights for Firestarter were purchased in 1980 by producer Dodi Fayed, who had just had a big hit with Chariots of Fire. So he had money to spend, and he was developing at Universal. And they commissioned a script from Bill Lancaster, who had just written The Thing for John Carpenter. The studio ended up reducing the proposed budget for the film down from $27 million to $15 million. And at that point, Carpenter basically decided to walk. Carpenter and Phillips went off and made Christine. That opened the door for Dino De Laurentiis to come in and take on Firestarter.
I had completed a movie called Class of 1984, which was very successful. So that's what prompted De Laurentiis to call me and want to start developing movies. And, he originally he said, "Can you find something that we can make together?" And I found this book called Year of the Dragon, which I then developed with the author of the book, Robert Daly. But then it ended up that, he got this project Firestarter from Universal, and he said, "I want to trade you and, do this project because it's going to go first." So the Year of the Dragon he gave to Michael Cimino, and I took this project Firestarter.
Charlie McGee is a healthy 8-year-old girl, normal in every way.
Charlie, now watch what you're doing.
But one.
You've got this father who has an exceptional child, and he's trying to protect her at all costs. And when he gets taken away from her, there's this new monstrous stepfather that kind of enters the picture and is basically turning her into a monster by manipulating her. That's the plot, and it's a pretty emotional story.
De Laurentiis, they had various suggestions, like people say, "Why is there wind blowing her hair?" Because they were looking for some kind of thing to happen while she created fires. So De Laurentiis and Stephen King came back and said, let's have her her hair moving when she gets this fire thoughts in her mind.
The idea of the government pursuing a young girl who has the power to ignite fire with her mind is a potent one. And it's still made for a good movie, but it's not one that has become historical.
You're gonna have to burn it down. Burn it all down.
I think Firestarter ended up being a little bit too much of a special effects movie, and in that respect being a little too cold for the material. it lacks some of the humanity, I think, of the novel. But the harshest critic was probably Stephen King, who had been at least somewhat involved in the making the film in terms of approving the script. But when the film came out, he actually called the movie flavorless, like cafeteria mashed potatoes.
At that time, he didn't like any film. He didn't even like The Shining, so I just don't think he ever was happy with any of these adaptations.
Stephen King, your favorite novelist and master of modern horror, has written his first motion picture screenplay.
So Cat's Eye is an anthology film that features 3 different Stephen King stories. 2 are short stories from the Night Shift collection, The Ledge and Quitters, Inc. And then the 3rd is actually an original screen story written by Stephen King called The General. The development of Cat's Eye as a project goes back to when Stephen King published the Night Shift collection in 1978. And around that time, he connected with a British producer named Milton Subotsky. He had done a bunch of different anthology films at Amicus, his company, and several of them were written by Robert Bloch, who was a writer that Stephen King really admired. It was actually Martha De Laurentiis who has said that Stephen King personally recommended to Dino that he buy some of those Night Shift stories back from Milton Subotsky and try to adapt them, that he would rather see Dino De Laurentiis do it than see Milton Subotsky do it. And so Dino De Laurentiis bought the rights to Quitters, Inc., The Ledge, and Sometimes They Come Back.
I did a film called Alligator. Then I got a call from somebody at Warner Brothers, a guy named Dan Blatt, who produced Cujo. And Dan told me when I went to meet with them that Stephen King had suggested me because he had seen Alligator. Stephen King was not that involved with the production of Cujo. After I did Cujo, then Dino called me and asked if I would direct Cat's Eye. Because it was an anthology, I was a little reluctant to do it because they notoriously never make any money. But I wanted to meet Stephen King, and Stephen King was directly involved in Cat's Eye.
I think Stephen King came up with this idea to connect the 3 pre-existing stories with the presence of a cat, because he had been developing a new story that was about a little boy who was being kind of hunted by a troll in his room at night, and the cat was going to come to his rescue. So Stephen King wasn't able to get that short story to work. So I think when Dino De Laurentiis came along and was trying to ask him to shoehorn Drew Barrymore into this anthology, Stephen King said, "Oh, all right, I'll take this and I'll repurpose it, and the boy becomes a girl, and we're off and running."
Frank Yablans, who was head of Paramount at that time, looked at it and thought it was over the top. And I agreed with him. I said, it's definitely over the top. If you've seen the rest of the film, I think it's a great setup. And he didn't feel that way. I think they were also worried about how they were going to sell the film because it was a series of short stories.
Cat's Eye.
Well, Silver Bullet comes not from a novel or a short story that King wrote, but from a graphic novel, a collaboration with the great artist Bernie Wrightson called Cycle of the Werewolf.
Coscarelli came in as the potential director, read it, and suggested that Stephen King himself should write the screenplay. In his memoir, Coscarelli says he really wanted to keep the werewolf off screen for as long as possible in this story because there had been a lot of werewolf movies made around the time this was in development. He didn't want to have to compete with those or didn't want to repeat them as kind of a special effects driven werewolf movie. Dino De Laurentiis wanted a special effects driven werewolf movie. That was a big get. I think that sort of undermined Coscarelli's pitch from the beginning. And so at a certain point, he's not involved anymore.
It began in May, and every month after that, whenever the moon was full, it happened again.
The development of the werewolf costume was, of course, critical. And it had been a process ongoing before I came onto the project. Silver Bullet had a minuscule budget. It did not have anything close to the budget required to really do a state-of-the-art look. It was difficult. The creature wasn't ready when it was supposed to be ready. We were into prep. Dino shot down a few ideas that had been pitched.
The script definitely has some twisted humor in it to begin with, and it'll go from being this really poignant, nostalgic voiceover narration, and then it will move on to just kind of slapstick humor.
Hi, my name is Stephen King. I've written several motion pictures, but I want to tell you about a movie called Maximum Overdrive, which is the first one I've directed.
Maximum Overdrive is the culmination of the Stephen King Dino De Laurentiis collaboration. And it's the put up or shut up moment where King was finally given an opportunity to completely control a movie and make it his way. And he really swung for the fences. Maximum Overdrive is just a wild, unrestrained blast of self-indulgence. Maximum Overdrive is based on a short story from the Night Shift collection called Trucks. Like most of the stories in that collection, it's a pretty bleak story. To me, Trucks it's almost like a mechanical version of Night of the Living Dead.
Like The Mangler, another example of technology gone berserk. And I think that King, from as early as Night Shift, that King is already showing signs of having a kind of sci-fi connection to the dangers of technology.
What in the dickens is going on around here? A lot of people have directed Stephen King novels and stories. And I finally decided if you want something done right, you ought to do it yourself.
Maximum Overdrive remains the only feature film that Stephen King has directed. And I know he always had interest in directing, and I'm sure Dino came to him and said, hey, what do you think about doing this? He was excited to try it, but all of the odds were against him. Dino gave him a crew that did not speak English. They shot in North Carolina at Dino's studios on a very limited budget.
King has freely admitted that he was at the height of his addiction at that point, both in terms of cocaine, alcohol, as well as fame. And I think all of these things had gone to his head.
You're going to get us in an awful lot of trouble, man.
We already in trouble.
Maximum terror.
Jesus coming in here.
You know, it's just as hard to make a movie that doesn't work as it is to make a movie that does work. For it to have been so badly reviewed, you know, he was putting himself up against Cronenberg and Kubrick and De Palma and all these other people. And when people think of Stephen King movies, they think of the best ones like that. They don't think of the drive-in movies. They were more mid-level, playing to a genre audience rather than a crossover audience.
It was my first picture as a director, and you know something? I sort of enjoyed it.
Maximum Overdrive kind of killed Stephen King adaptations for a while. I mean, it was like, you know, here's the guy himself crashing and burning. He really, for a period of time, you know, kind of damaged his own brand.
I'm going to scare the hell out of you.
You have to tell a story with a structure and all this stuff that obviously in a book you can just, you know, go as he does, the way he writes. You know, it's like a stream of thought sometimes that, you know, you're just there within the character. And certain adaptations work really well, and other ones, it just like doesn't, you know, quite make it.
Stephen King is a genius. I mean, his books are amazing. I've read a lot of them now. He's a true genius, wonderful man. I wouldn't dispute anything he says. Whatever he thinks is probably correct.